Plan on flying? It's time to upgrade to a real ID. Because in order to board domestic flights, your driver's license or state-issued ID must be a real ID, or you'll need another acceptable form of identification. So don't wait. Find out how to get your real ID at tsa.gov/realid. That's tsa.gov/realid, or visit your local DMV. And then you'll be cleared for takeoff.
This show is about American history as viewed primarily through the lens of baseball. As such, I talk about immigrants and immigration a lot because, like it or not, immigrants, or the immediate children of immigrants, built the game as we experience it. You cannot tell the story of baseball without including America's experience with immigration as part of the story, in the same way that you can't tell the story of baseball without alluding to America's history of racism, and vice versa. I began the show back in 2017, and at that time, and seemingly virtually every minute thereafter, the American polity has been having an argument about immigration, so such examples have seemed especially urgent and pointed. I suppose what I've been trying to say is, hey, before you succumb to the propaganda and the prejudice, take a look at these other examples. It's easy to get angry or be frightened by an amorphous, unnamed, unspecified group that we just call aliens. But on an individual basis, it's easy for us to cheer for Ichiro Suzuki, not born on these shores, Adrian Beltre, not born on these shores, Minnie Minoso, Tony Oliva, David Ortiz. These are just the last few inductees to the Hall of Fame who happen to have been born somewhere other than Hoboken, New Jersey, Schenectady, Omaha, Boise. You get the picture. Pedro Martinez came from the exact same island that a lot of ball players come from, the Dominican Republic. That island is split between two countries, the Republic, which I just mentioned, and Haiti. As countries, both those places can be kind of a mess, which is one of many reasons why, in addition to being able to pitch like Pedro Martinez, that people who were born there want to come here. As individuals will take people who pitch like Pedro Martinez, even if they're from that island, as a group. If they can't throw like Pedro Martinez, they can just fill ordinary jobs. We accuse them of eating cats. That's why I say we have to look at people as individuals, not as an undifferentiated mass, and not because someone with the skills of Pedro Martinez might be hiding in there, but because the mass doesn't tell you anything. It may tell you, well, we've got a whole collection of people from this place or this time or this religion or this culture, and so maybe there are certain generalizations you can make about the things that they were brought up to believe or the practices that they have in that culture, but whether they're good or bad people, to speak in very broad, blunt terms, well, you throw any 100 people together, you're going to get a range of outcomes. And that would be the same if we're talking about 100 Americans selected at random. You're going to have somewhere in that 100 the worst person, and you're going to have the best person by whatever criteria you set up. It's going to be arbitrary regardless. And then in the middle, well, you have the average people. And somewhere around person 50, if you rank them correctly, there is one person who you could trust with your wallet if you dropped it, and one person who you can't. And everyone who you've ranked as being more moral than that person, when you drop your wallet, you're going to get it back with the money still in it. And everyone who you have judged to be less moral than that person is off standing to their right, and you are not going to get your money back. And in fact, at the very end of the line, the worst person in the group, again, assuming you have the clairvoyance, the insight to rank them perfectly, that person is going to take all your personal information and not only take out any cash that you happen to have on you, but run up your credit cards and drain your bank accounts and so forth. Now, what if those 100 people were all immigrants? What does the worst person in the group teach you about the best person or the average person? Not a thing. The unthinking bigot's response is going to be, well, they're all like that. They're brought up to be like that. They're savages. And my answer would be, prove it. And so I like to talk about counterexamples to that narrative. Going back to the earliest parts of the game, some of our foundational characters. Connie Mack was born Cornelius McGillicuddy, and his parents Michael and Mary were right off the boat from Ireland. George Bernard Shaw called John McGraw the real and authentic, most remarkable man in America. And although I think he was sneering when he said it, condescending to McGraw and to baseball and to Americans in general, he was right. John McGraw was a self-made man, but his dad also came here from Ireland. Babe Ruth's parents were first-generation Americans via Germany, so he was not the direct child of immigrants, but the guy spoke German to Lou Gehrig's parents, who did come here directly from Germany. Now, everyone I just mentioned are white Europeans, so retroactively, they're okay in the minds of our leading bigots, but that wasn't always the case. We Americans have a slur for everyone. It's just that some of them go out of fashion. You might already be aware that every black porter on a Pullman car, when that was the primary way we did long-distance travel by trains in this country, every black porter was called George, for the company founder George Pullman. Just watch any 1930s movie on TCM, and when they get to a train scene, you'll see what I mean. But did you know that in the 19th century, as Irish women came over here and began working as domestic servants in the mansions of the wealthy, they all became Bridget? Never mind their names. They were just Bridget. As in, I had to fire my Bridget. The poor trash was stealing from me. Oh, I know just what you mean. My Bridget is so terribly lazy. Hank Greenberg's folks, Jewish immigrants from Romania. One of the early stars of the Negro Leagues, Cristobal Torriente, now in the Hall of Fame, straight out of Cuba. He was one of those who made later stars, the ones who desegregated the game possible. Joe DiMaggio and his brothers Dom and Vince, Abundanza! I just wanted to shout Abundanza. His parents, their parents I should say, immigrants, just humble fishermen. One of my favorite lines is one that Yankees center fielder Mickey Rivers apparently said to Reggie Jackson somewhere in the 1970s when they were both on that team. Mickey noted that Reggie's full name was Reginald Martinez Jackson and said, "You've got a white guy's first name, a Latino guy's middle name, and a black guy's last name. No wonder you're a mess." He didn't mean it as a compliment. He meant it as a dig, friendly dig, I think, but still a dig. But Reggie was the melting pot in one name and 563 home runs. Again, my point in bringing up these previous waves of migration, waves that brought us the fabric of the game, is that you have to look at everyone as an individual. Hank Greenberg, a credit to his heritage. Arnold Rothstein, Bugsy Siegel, not so much. And you can do this with every single ethnicity or nationality on this planet, which is why collective punishment, and for that matter, collective praise, is for idiots and racists. As for Americans, I swear this is not an exaggeration. I think of Colonel John Chivington every single day. When some bloviating talking head goes on about American exceptionalism or being a shining city on a hill, I think of Colonel Chivington. When someone talks about educating our children in Americanism or American values or the real patriotic American history, I think of Colonel Chivington. Chivington was the American officer who led what is now referred to as the Sand Creek Massacre in 1864 in Colorado, in which he led the cavalry down on a defenseless Native American village composed mostly of women and children, shouting, "Kill them all, nits breed lice." If you claim Valley Forge is part of your heritage, you claim that too. If you claim the Gettysburg Address is part of your heritage, you claim that too. He did that during the Lincoln administration, the great, loving, generous Abraham Lincoln, our martyr. I don't know if Lincoln had a comment on it or not. Everyone is a Venn diagram of good and bad. Of course, some people's bad circle is much larger than the average person's and vice versa. And in the case of someone like Chivington, that one bad act swamps anything else he might have done. But it's worth remembering this about people. When you start to feel a little prideful, a little jingoistic about the land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrim's pride, from every mountainside, let freedom ring. That sometimes, like all people, we Americans have been our best selves, and at other times we have failed to live up to our own example and become our worst selves. Our current government is obsessed with getting Venezuelans out of the country. A lot of other people too, but Venezuelans who came here fleeing that nation's failed government. Yesterday, as I record these words, the administration asked the United States Supreme Court to end temporary legal protections for 350,000 Venezuelans who had been given exemptions from deportation because the prior administration found that their country was too dangerous for them to return to. That's about 7 sold-out Yankee stadiums, a little more than that actually, of Venezuelan people. That number is also about 60% of the total number of Venezuelans who are here or were here. I don't know how many human beings of Venezuelan birth have already been deported. Do you know from Venezuela? I admit I don't. I can find it on a globe with not too much trouble. I know it's a Spanish-speaking country and that the vast majority of the people practice Catholicism. I know they have a lot of capybaras there, and the capybara might be the most blameless creature on the planet. They've got the crab-eating fox, too, which not only has a beautiful gray-black coat, it is a very discerning carnivore. Losing Red Lobster was a huge blow to this animal. Emotionally, I mean. I really don't know if it's ever going to recover its sense of joie de vivre. Folks, before you adopt a depressed crab-eating fox, make sure it will accept scungili, because not all of them do. Actually, I've never met a crab-eating fox. I don't know if I've ever met a crab-eating Venezuelan or any other kind of Venezuelan. What I do know is that I've seen a lot of home runs by Maglio Ordonez, Andres Galarraga, Miguel Cabrera. I've seen many a ball go over Bobby Abreu's head. And just the other day, like many of us, I thrilled to Eugenio Suarez hitting 4 home runs in a single game. One of the first really cool outfields I saw, one where every player was above average. This was when I first learned to be a real baseball fan. That outfield belonged to the Boston Red Sox. The left fielder was Jim Rice. The right fielder was Dwight Evans. Now, Evans was born in California and Rice in South Carolina, but the center fielder, Tony Armas, was born in Puerto Piritu, Venezuela. He led the American League in home runs that year, 1984, with 43, at a time that there weren't very many 40 home run seasons. Now look, the game has had Venezuelan players in it going back to the 1930s. The first was Alex Carrasquel, who spent 7 seasons pitching for the Washington Senators. 489 others have followed in his footsteps since then. Do I know that they were all terrific people? Of course I don't. But I don't have any reason to make a blanket assumption about them one way or another. Chick Gandil was born in Minnesota. Ben Chapman was born in Tennessee. Pete Rose was born in Ohio. Trevor Bauer was born in California. Should those facts instruct us that all Americans are like them? There is presently one player from Venezuela in the Hall of Fame, the speedy shortstop Luis Aparicio. He'll be joined there one day by Miguel Cabrera. I hope he's around to see it, as he's in his 90s, and we are all very much day-to-day all the time, but never more so than if we make it to our 90s. Jose Altuve might get there at some point, too. It seemed like Omar Vizquel was pointed that way until some unsavory off-the-field stuff was revealed, which gets to my point. Omar Vizquel's comportment tells us nothing about Miguel Cabrera. They're separate people who happen to have a point of origin in common. Hell, you know that from your high school. Your 9th grade best friend and your 9th grade worst enemy both came from the same town in the same state, and for all I know, were born in the same hospital. And yet, they were very different people. You know, one of the people who falls under that latter category for me, not exactly an enemy, but someone who I didn't respect and seemed to be, even as a kid, without ethics or morals, subsequently, they ended up working for the people who put that tangled pasta snarl of garbage links at the bottom of your lesser web pages, which is like most of them at this point. And seeing those, every time I see those, I think, Of course they did. Of course that's where they ended up working. They put unasked for barnacles on the bottom of other people's experience, or maybe just on other people's bottoms. Sure, it's a living, and we've all got to work. We've all got to eat. And I have no doubt that person makes more money than I do, but money ain't the only value, and I'd rather try to contribute positively than just pollute the lives of others so I can afford DoorDash. But I was talking about our friends from Venezuela. I would love to see some team that doesn't feel like bending over to bigotry, to generalization, to this strange ethno-nationalism. Stage a Venezuelan all-star night. Maybe the Braves or Tigers or Marlins. The Braves because Ronald Acuna Jr., who is from Venezuela, is one of the biggest stars on that team, one of the biggest stars in the game, at least when he's healthy. You could invite or at least celebrate a hell of an all-star team. I've already mentioned a bunch of them, but quickly, Andres Galarraga, first base. And let's not forget Luis Arraez of San Felipe, Venezuela, and his current streak of 3 batting titles. Altuve could play second base, or if he's busy, Edgardo Alfonso, who had some great seasons for the Mets. Would it be okay with you if we list Miguel Cabrera as the third baseman? He wasn't really one, but he did have 700 games over at the hot corner. Maybe they weren't Brooks Robinson games, but they were games. You could put Alfonso there too. He actually had more games at third than he did have at second. Or Melvin Mora. Remember what a great arm Melvin Mora had? Shortstop has to be Aparicio, but it would be great to see Dave Concepcion of the Big Red Machine there as well. The catchers are Salvi Perez, if available, Victor Martinez, if not, 2,100 hits and a career .295 average for Victor Martinez of Ciudad Bolivar. We could grab both Contreras brothers as well, Wilson of the Brewers, William of the Cardinals. Neither is off to a great start, but they were both, or are both, very good players. I've got a super sub too, Minnesota Twins great Cesar Tovar. He's not with us anymore, but he played every position and will light 9 candles for every position that he played. The outfielders I've already mentioned, Acuna, Ordonez, Abreu, Armas. My starting pitchers would be Johan Santana and King Felix. Your closer is K-Rod, Francisco Rodriguez, and he just reinforces my point, because down the list of closers from Venezuela, from him, a good distance from him, because he had over 400 saves, is Felipe Vasquez, who used to pitch and pitch very well for the Pittsburgh Pirates recently. He proved to be a sex criminal, a pedophile sex criminal. That he was that, does it tell us anything about anyone else on this list? Jared Fogle, the Subway pitchman, is still in prison for that same reason. He was born in Indiana. What do his crimes tell us about Don Mattingly, who's from Evansville? There are 11 Hall of Famers from the state of Indiana. Should we take back their plaques? Should we assume something negative about their characters because they're from the same neighborhood as the perverted Subway guy? There was a story in the Washington Post this week about one Jesus Rodriguez, a Venezuelan national legally living and working as a music teacher in a Washington, D.C. suburb. He's self-deporting because he's afraid the government of Americans, by Americans, and conducted in the name of all Americans is going to send him to a dungeon in El Salvador if he doesn't get out of town. Again, he's here legally. Again, he has a job that benefits his community. He is, to quote Casey Stengel, someone for the United States. And yet, he has to live in fear and in fact has to leave because Americans want him gone. Why? Because of where he's from? Because of his skin color? Because of his accent? Because what? He did what he was supposed to do. He came here legally under a government program. You know where music teachers end up under despotic government? They end up in dungeons. That's the joke. And that's the punchline. Rodriguez left Venezuela so he didn't end up in a dungeon, and he's leaving what we call the land of the brave and the home of the free so he doesn't end up in a dungeon. If he fled despotism to stay out of the dungeon and arrived somewhere where the dungeon is still on the menu, then what does that imply about the place that he ended up? I know they took the analogies off the SAT some years ago, but this one isn't hard. Dungeon is to dictator as dungeon is to what? I believe in math. They call that an identity. 1 equals 1. Congratulations. In the life of a nation, every single person who comes to your door is an opportunity to receive a benefit or, yes, an injury. He might be from Sicily, and he grows up to be Lucky Luciano and leaves a lot of bodies strewn everywhere. He might be Andy Kosciuszko of Poland and ends up helping you win a war, which I suppose is also leaving a lot of bodies strewn everywhere, but in a constructive way for the country. There's no way of knowing without letting them in and giving them a chance. Where should they go if not here? And don't say home, because they left there for a reason. They can't just jump in the air and never come down. So the only place that's left, once you've eliminated there and here, is no place at all. And we call that land the infinite inning. Well, hello there, and welcome back to the show, Infinite Inning number 328. In an ongoing series, I am your convivial host, your conductor on a ride to the past as a means of understanding the present. My name is, and has been, Stephen Goldman, and I hope you are well on this wonderful late Friday night / Saturday, or whatever day you happen to be dialing up this particular episode. So, following up on some comments I made last week, I'm going to continue to keep the ad breaks clear of the kind of commentary that I've made on old-timey music as part of the show going back these 8 years. Again, I've been careful to provide commentary. I feel like that's fair use. Sites like YouTube are just full of people saying, hey, here's me listening to all of the White Album. This is my reaction to hearing Cry Baby Cry and the Savoy Truffle for the first time. And you do hear the music, but I am being called out for doing the same thing. And I'm not sure how to argue with it, but I want the show to be in as many places as possible, including YouTube, where, again, I'm made to understand that people are consuming a lot of podcasts that way. And this show, the format of it, since we gave up on guests, particularly after the first something like 300 episodes, it doesn't lend itself to me being on camera just because there's nothing to see, really. I mean, you would see me talking into a microphone and staring at my notes, and I can't imagine why anyone would want to do that. If you want to listen to it, great. I'll put it up and it will be there starting, I think, in the coming week. But I just don't know why you would want me. I mean, I would do it. My vanity is such that if I could be once again back on a screen as I used to be in my Yes Network days, I guess I would do it. But I just don't see how the show lends itself to that. So my plan now is, since all of the back catalog is seemingly verboten on certain platforms, you can certainly still get it. You can get it via Baseball Prospectus. You can get it via its home at Spreaker and many other places, but certain episodes have been dropped at places like Spotify. So what I'm going to try to do is once a week release something from the back catalog, re-release it, I mean. And I think I'll probably chop off the interviews unless I think that something really scintillating happened there. To be honest, I don't always remember. This is such a hectic and pell-mell production that as soon as I'm done, a lot of the details just go right out of my mind. I've looked into transcripting the old episodes so I could at least read them and have my memory refreshed, but what comes out is, it's not total gibberish. It's not because of the originals. It's because the transcripting services have no sense of cadence or inflection or spelling or anything like that. So you just get this mad rush of verbs with very few breaks in between, and it's very hard to tell what was good and what, again, is just a wall of words, and not a good wall of words. Like if you're at the Lincoln Memorial and they have the text of the second inaugural address on the wall and you can read it and feel very moved and solemn about it. No, this is just like ipsum lorem over and over again. But what I'll do is I will go through those episodes. I will shrink them down to story time, just like the current show. And maybe in select instances, or many, I will record new introductions. I don't know if they'll be long. I don't know if they'll be deep. But for those who have heard them, I'll try to provide some added value should you choose to listen to them. And for those who have not gone through the back catalog, well, they'll just be new to you with extra new stuff. And along the way, I will take out the bits that these services, these platforms are objecting to, and Bob's your uncle. We will have the whole run of the show up everywhere once again. I'm going to keep the bulletin board section brief because we are already overdue for a break, the very kind of break that got me in trouble in the first place. Commerce, capitalism. Like I said before, you got to eat, you got to pay the bills, but there must have been another way. It probably involved fruit. You scratch my banana, I'll scratch your... Well, no, that sounds kind of dirty, so we'll leave that aside. We'll push fruit capitalism back onto the drawing board. Over at Baseball Prospectus this week, I was inspired by, I just happened to see this, a new show on Broadway. It just moved to Broadway after a trial run off Broadway called Dead Outlaw. It's now up for something like 7 Tony Awards. And it's the story, a true story, of a small-time Western outlaw named Elmer McCurdy, who was killed in his line of work, as many old-time Western bad guys were, and his story didn't end. He became a very well-traveled cadaver. Yes, it sounds macabre that this fellow had a much longer afterlife than he did a life. But what struck me, and I like the show very much, but what kept nagging at me, was that he was an exact contemporary, more or less. He was 7 years younger than John J. McGraw. I already mentioned him, one of the foundational figures of the modern game, really. A guy who won 10 pennants. 13, if you count his playing career. And they both were sort of on parallel lines until they diverged. But both came from broken homes, both hit the rails, and then they went in very different directions. And so I wanted to explore that parallel, and I wanted to ask if we have similar inflection points in our own lives to the ones that they faced, that moment when they got up on that train, and ask how much choice we have in deciding what kind of people we're going to be. There's no baseball in the show except for one mention of Babe Ruth. And I talk about that in the essay I wrote for BP as well, because it goes to the theme of the show. Once again, you can find that at Baseball Prospectus. It's called McGraw and McCurdy Mystery Train. And I do hope you'll read it and let me know what you think. And with that, it is finally time to take a break. On the other side, I want to revisit a story I've told before, one of the great, weird, painful ones, from an angle I hadn't understood till now. John McGraw is in this one too. I guess he's just sort of on my mind this week. So on the other side, should you choose to stay with me, and I very much hope you do, the wife of the man they called Shufflin Phil. Hey, hear this music? I own it. I co-wrote it. Ha ha. You can't tell me I'm violating my own copyright, you bastards. One of the best parts of my job is getting to discover aspects of a story that was familiar to you, even over-familiar, and realizing that you hadn't understood it all, or at least hadn't known everything there was to know about it. It's also one of the most frustrating parts because it means taking the time to recover old ground, and sometimes it doesn't pay off in any new nuggets. Such is the life of the grizzled old prospector. This past week, I was doing that with the story of 1920s spitball pitcher Shufflin Phil Douglas. Now, I'm not going to tell that story in full because I think I gave you a decent chunk of it back in episode 146, and that makes 146 a good candidate for the reissue campaign. I'll do one a week, I hope, that I just talked about. I want to give you the highlights version because rather than dwell on the story at length, and it really would take up 2-3 hours. I could do 2-3 hours on this story. I'm not kidding. I have enough material for a novella, at least. I want to get to that angle that involves Shufflin Phil's wife, who I feel pretty certain I didn't mention at all the first time that I talked about this. So again, rather than giving you every quote, every line, I am going to be relatively quick about it so we can get to the new stuff. So as briefly as your old pal Steve is capable of making something, and you know that's not very brief, Phil Douglas was a right-handed pitcher. He was born in Georgia in 1890, and he spent most of his life in that corner of Georgia that abuts Tennessee near Chattanooga, and he kind of jumped back and forth between the Tennessee side of the line and the Georgia side of the line, and he also lived in Birmingham for a bit. He first came up in 1912 with the White Sox. He was a very large specimen for the American teens and 1920s, and he added to that, upon reaching the White Sox, a spitball, which he was taught by Big Ed Walsh, one of the great spitball pitchers. Phil chewed some resiny tree bark and loaded up the ball. That was legal when he first came up, and then subsequently he was one of the 16 grandfathered spitball pitchers after 1920. On the mound, he was mostly considered a pretty smart pitcher. I also came across a quote from his Giants catcher, Frank Pancho Snyder, who said, no, he was just about burning them in there, but that was kind of an outlier. Everyone talked about how clever and canny a pitcher he was, which was meant to contrast with how he was off the mound, which was not smart or educated. And he added to that, or further dulled his wits, with liberal applications of alcohol, which he hit hard between every start. And sometimes that meant that he left the team and didn't come back for the start after. He called this taking a vacation. Said vacations meant that though he was a good pitcher, he was kicked from team to team as he exhausted the trust and patience of his managers. Now, John McGraw, who took over the Giants in 1902 towards the end of the season, liked problem players. I don't think he enjoyed them necessarily, but he had enough, unearned confidence really in his own will that he thought that he could break these guys and get them to toe the line in a way that he could win pennants with them. Sometimes he was right, often he was wrong. He thought that Shufflin Phil, if he could sober him up, would be as good a pitcher as Christy Mathewson. That's a light paraphrase of something he actually said. Well, he failed. Douglas wasn't scared of him, and he kept taking his vacations. So John McGraw went to plan B. He assigned several different chaperones to keep Douglas out of the speakeasies. Remember, in the 1920s, the sale of alcoholic drinks was illegal. It's so bizarre that we did that, but that's a subject for another time. Not because I think alcoholic beverages are the end-all, be-all, but there was just this national experiment in telling people, and the entire country said, and organized crime was born, essentially. And stick a pin in this, some people didn't accept that. They didn't accept that no matter what the law said, that some people were going to drink and that this was a failed effort and that eventually it was going to get repealed. So they started poisoning the alcohol and they killed a number of people that way. Sometimes we say that a guy won't take no for an answer and we look at that as a positive quality. It isn't, at least not in all contexts. In some contexts, it's downright threatening or dangerous. And it is antithetical to the idea of democracy. Now, some of McGraw's chaperones Phil Douglas ditched or intimidated. One, a man named O'Brien, decided that if you can't beat him, join him, and he drank with Phil. The idea being, and I think there's some merit to this, that it was unrealistic to think that someone as badly addicted as he was could go cold turkey. So why not stick with him and be there to cut him off before things got bad? This is something that, in a different way, is being argued in our society today in terms of people who become addicted to opioid painkillers. Because there's one school that says you do a certain amount of rehab and then people are considered to be over it, they're on their own, and I don't know, maybe they go to meetings, but they don't have anything else in their system from then on that might dull their cravings. Conversely, there are drugs that are like opioid painkillers and contain aspects of the same chemicals but are less harmful and less addictive. So the thought is that this is a way of kind of tapering people off. I believe it's the same concept that has long been behind the idea of getting people off heroin and then on to methadone, at least for a while. And of course, there's a moralistic aspect to this, which is, do you cure people of addiction with addiction? Having said that, I think that that's a particularly pejorative and small-minded way to put it, because it's not a moral problem. It's a chemical problem. It's a neurological problem. And these drugs are so strong that they burn out the dopamine receptors in your brain, and you're not who you were in a biological sense. So just saying you can overcome this with therapy and willpower, I don't think that that's fair. Well, this Detective O'Brien and I were of a like mind about that, just 103 or so years apart, but John McGraw did not agree. He hated the idea, and he fired the guy. The final chaperone was the former outfielder Jesse Burkett, a fantastic hitter in his day, and he too is in the Hall of Fame, but he was known as the Crab because he was such a pleasant guy to be with. Surprisingly, he and Douglas seemed to have gotten along decently, but the days of Phil being able to kind of kite along with just enough booze were over. It was strictly ice cream sodas from then on. I've never understood ice cream sodas either, speaking of receptors. The ice cream is so sweet you can't taste the soda anymore, or vice versa. In early August 1922, Douglas was among the league leaders in ERA when he had a bad start against the Pirates, and McGraw ripped him in front of the whole team and accused him of having been too drunk to pitch. McGraw ripped Phil all the time, actually, but this tirade was especially vicious. Douglas took off, gave Jesse Burkett the slip, and disappeared for days. Again, having told this story before, I'm going to give you the quick version, not the fully dramatized one. After a few days, an entire weekend, the police found Douglas, and at the instructions of one of the owners, McGraw was one of the owners too, but I don't think that he was the one who made this specific call at this time, had Phil Douglas taken against his will to a hospital where the thing they did was treat addiction, not just alcohol, but drugs and something they called brain fag. And just for those who came in late, I am not using that word in terms of the homophobic slur, but rather in the slang sense of being tired. Phil was held hostage at this hospital. They took his clothes away. They sedated him repeatedly. He was basically tortured. There were a lot of quack cures for addiction back then, just as there are now, and Douglas was given one of them. When his wife Louise contacted the Giants and said, "Hey, have you seen Phil? Have you seen Phil?" They said, "Yeah, don't worry about it. It's not important." Burkett said that, actually. "We've got him. He's being held on John McGraw's orders, and everything's cool. You're fine." Well, where is he? I'm sorry, Mrs. Douglas. I'm just not at liberty to say. Well, she must have complained some more, because finally John McGraw called her, told her where Phil was, and she went to get him. But before she could take him out, they sedated him again, and he couldn't be moved. Finally, on the fourth day, she was able to get him out of there and take him home to their two young daughters. I wonder how things turned out for those daughters, who I believe were 11 and 9 at the time, 11 and 10, but I'm getting ahead of things. Douglas went back to the Giants. McGraw told him off again, and then presented him with a bill for his own kidnapping, and he didn't stop at just the hospital bill, but even included the taxi fare it cost to abduct him to the hospital. He also docked him 5 days' pay and fined him an additional $100 for not being in shape to pitch. Phil broke. He broke in a rather odd way. He wrote a letter to an acquaintance, a part-time outfielder on the second-place St. Louis Cardinals, saying, and again I am paraphrasing, "I hate John McGraw. I pitched him to a pennant last year," which was true. He also went 2-1 with a 2.08 ERA against the Yankees in the 1921 World Series, which the Giants won. I would prefer to not do that again, but if I'm still here, I'm afraid I'm going to do it in spite of myself. As such, how about you guys get up a collection, and with a little money in my pocket, I'll just go fishing for the rest of the season. Let me know. Love, Phil. Phil later said that he thought that when McGraw ripped him that previous time, that he had been fired, released, let go. And that's why he wrote the letter. Yet that doesn't make a lot of sense, because if he'd already been released, why would the Cardinals need to bribe him to leave? Believe me, John McGraw jumped on that contradiction when he finally caught into all of this. Once Phil sobered up a little, I don't think sobering up fully was really possible for him. He seems to have said, "Oh God, what have I done?" He had handed the letter to a clubhouse boy who posted it to the Cardinals in Boston, where they happened to be playing the Braves. Phil's wife placed a call to the Cardinals hotel in Boston, but Phil and the player he had picked, Les Mann, an outfielder, a Boy Scout, which makes the whole thing stranger. I don't mean a literal Boy Scout. I mean a Boy Scout in his attitudes and his comportment towards the game. Someone who was extremely unlikely to participate in any kind of fishy scheme that involved, well, here's another strange part. Phil never offered to throw a game. He never did, as far as we know, throw a game. Yes, he was seeking a bribe to leave. His purpose was corrupt, but any ball games that were played as a result of his absence still would have been on the up and up, as if he had had an injury and been unable to pitch. Phil kept calling while Mann was out of his room, and they had trouble connecting for a while. But once they finally talked, Douglas said, "Look, I didn't know what I was doing. Just tear that letter up, would you?" And Mann said, "I don't have it. I haven't gotten it yet, but if it's important, I'm sure I will, and I'll tear it up." In fact, whereas we can't be sure of the exact timing, it's pretty clear that by that point, Mann had already received the letter, thought, uh-oh, I don't want any part of this, and turned it over to his manager, another person who prided himself on being a straight arrow, Branch Rickey, who said, "Judas Priest, this is a hot potato." That's an actual quote, and he forwarded it to John McGraw and the commissioner of baseball, Judge Kennesaw Mountain Landis. The two of them confronted Shufflin Phil with the letter. Douglas admitted he had written it, and Landis banned him on the spot. It all happened so fast that Douglas wasn't even sure that it had happened. He had to ask a second time, but that was also an artifact, most likely, of his having had many consecutive days of copious amounts of booze, tranquilizers, laxatives, and God knows what else. Laxatives were part of the, quote, cure. That's cure, with scare quotes around it. It was sedation, hot showers or cold showers, frequent injections of, depending on the clinic, bespoke concoctions that were some combination of vitamins and other substances, some of them pointless, some of them toxic, and purgatives, things that made you expel from your body whatever was in it from one orifice or another. I guess the idea being that you had to clean yourself out of all those nasty addictive chemicals that were in you. But of course, I don't know how to put this in a nice way. I mean, addiction is neurological, and the part of the body that laxatives act on is not the brain, not the part that is important to addiction. Anyway, I don't know. I suppose if there were such a thing as brain laxatives, it might be a positive thing. It was the Electric Prunes, right, who had the song in the mid-'60s, "I had too much to dream last night." So you had too much to dream. You treat that with your Neurolax. The only question, and please don't try to answer this, is when Neurolax purges all those nightmares, where do the thoughts exit the body? On that glorious and appetizing note, let's take one last quick break, and on the other side, I'll get to Mrs. Douglas. How did she cope with her husband's terrible mistake? You know, to get back to Dead Outlaw for just half a second, I said when I brought it up in the first half of the show that the only mention of baseball is a reference to Babe Ruth. It occurs to me that rather randomly, they mentioned Bert Convy. And for those of you who are old enough and were around in, say, the late 70s, early 80s, Bert Convy was ubiquitous on television, whether guest starring on shows of the Love Boat kind or hosting game shows. And it occurred to me as I was sitting here during that break and thinking about it, that Bert Convy was, before he went into acting and game show hosting, was a minor league outfielder with the Philadelphia Phillies. It obviously didn't go well, but he played professional baseball at places like Klamath Falls, starting in 1951 when he was 17 and ending rather quickly in 1952. Unfortunately, he developed an aggressive brain cancer in his 50s and checked out about 34 years ago now. So as the song goes, enjoy yourself. It's later than you think, but then that's part of the theme of that show, which may in fact be why they chose to mention such an obscure figure. So to Louise Douglas, this is the part that I wanted to talk about that I haven't talked about before. Douglas, perhaps having some sense of what he had done, Phil, I mean, not Mrs. Douglas, was about halfway to having a nervous breakdown in the days right before the axe fell, which is to say, after McGraw told him off for one of the last times, after he had sent the letter, but before the letter had landed. He had the team doctor visit him at his apartment and administer yet more sedatives. I think that was his idea, not McGraw's, or more broadly speaking, just the Giants as an organization. There would have been about 3 different people who might have made that call, McGraw being one of them, one of the co-owners, a corrupt judge named McQuaid, another, and of course, the owner, Charles Stoneham, being the third. He doesn't pop up that much in this story. McQuaid and McGraw do. I think that Stoneham had bigger fish to fry, being, well, essentially a full-time gambler and bucket shop owner, which is a way of turning the stock market into a casino and nowadays very illegal. Douglas did say that he was in bad shape. Those were his words at the time. So I'm not sure if the Giants offered him the team doctor or he requested it. But once again, he was put back to sleep. And while he was dozing, the team left on a road trip for Pittsburgh. Once Phil woke up and felt better, he and Jesse Burkett got on a train west and caught the team a day or so later. It was when he got to the club hotel, the Shenley in Pittsburgh, that he found McGraw and the judge waiting for him. McGraw was so angry and so vindictive that not only did he see to it that Phil was banned from baseball, but he immediately canceled his room in the team hotel. I guess it kind of is like when you're fired from a job nowadays and they don't wait around for you to clean up. They just throw all your stuff in a box and frog march you out the door. Since McGraw also refused to pay him out, Phil had nowhere to stay and no money to buy a ticket back home. A writer found him, crying. "What makes me so mad," he said, weeping, "is that Mac won't even give me my pay. I don't know how I'm going to get out of here unless I get some money. I'm ashamed to wire my wife." Someone eventually slipped him $100. It may have been Giant shortstop Dave Bancroft, by all accounts a very nice man, or it might have been McGraw acting through Bancroft. The answer doesn't really matter, in that if it was McGraw, well, McGraw was known to be both a vicious asshole and a soft touch, that he was possibly both at once, even with a player he was as mad at as he was at Phil Douglas, was consistent for him and doesn't really change anything about the way he treated Douglas throughout their roughly 3 years together. With his season cut off prematurely, Phil led the National League in ERA. He was a good pitcher when he was into it, but as I've been saying, he wasn't reliable. And that is the one sense in which I do have sympathy for all the people who had to deal with him on the Giants, even John McGraw, because here you are taking a chance on a pitcher, and you know the pitcher can be good. Everyone who ever saw Phil Douglas knew he was a good pitcher, and in fact, given that his season was cut off prematurely, he ended up going out of the major leagues for life. on a season in which he led the National League in ERA. That said, he often disappeared before key series. He wasn't there when they needed him, and even in the days in which he did show up, they had to worry about it until it happened, which is very stressful. And anyone who has ever had the difficulty in their life of having a friend or a loved one have a substance abuse problem knows that simultaneously you try to have sympathy or empathy or understanding for the person who is going through what they're going through, but at the same time, it's very frustrating and difficult to have to deal with someone who, by virtue of their illness, cannot be relied upon. That's real too, and it's one of the ways that if you're in a family or friend unit and you have this kind of problem, and it could be not a substance abuse problem, but a psychological problem like narcissism or rage, it spills over into other people. It doesn't just affect the person who has the illness, and in some ways, they start to share in the illness. And no, they're not the ones who are in danger of having an overdose or crashing the car, but they are suffering nonetheless. And the thing about Phil Douglas in particular was that he was a very assertive abuser of alcohol. He really believed that the days between starts were his time, and he could use that time to get lit. And if that prevented him from winning more games than he did, well, he had won a bunch of them already, and the Giants should be satisfied with what they got. One of the Giants co-owners who I just mentioned, the Judge Francis X. McQuaid, again a crook himself, said, "Without doubt, Douglas, when right, is one of the greatest pitchers in the game, but we are glad to get rid of him. He was far more trouble to John McGraw than the public can appreciate. When we got the goods on Douglas, we did not wait a day. We acted as quickly as possible to get him off the roster of the club and out of the game. I have no sympathy for the man, not after the way he treated us and the way we treated him." In short, there are no good guys in this story, and Douglas may have been weak even beyond his issues with demon rum. You know how a moment ago I quoted him as saying, "I'm ashamed to wire my wife." I think he went further than that. I think he was ashamed even to tell her the truth about what he had done. I think he lied to her about it. Given that the 1919 World Series fix was very recent for the people who lived this story, and that fix really was a conspiracy, a cockeyed one with a lot of parties working at cross purposes to each other and screwing one another over, but a conspiracy nevertheless. And no, it did not stay secret for long, which should be a lesson to us when any of our more paranoid brethren start talking about conspiracies, deep state or otherwise, secret cabals that control our lives because people like to talk. And because that was fresh in everyone's mind, when the Douglas story broke, one of the questions that was asked repeatedly was, did he do this himself or was there someone behind it? Did some gang of gamblers get him to try and throw the pennant to the Cardinals? Now, it would seem pretty obvious that these would have had to have been fairly stupid gamblers if this was what they were going to try. One of the odder aspects of this story is that Phil Douglas, again, had not offered to throw games. He just said he wanted to go home and not pitch for the Giants. In punishing him for making that offer, Landis and McGraw actually gave him what he wanted. The only difference was that he didn't get paid. To the Giants, there was no difference. They lost their best pitcher. And guess what? Like a lot of great teams, the Giants had the depth to withstand the blow, won the pennant anyway, and they won the World Series too. The conditions of the hypothetical conspiracy were fulfilled, and yet nothing changed. And let that be a lesson to you. Everyone who is pissed at their boss and wants to quit says, I am not appreciated. I do so much around here. No one else does half as much as I do. This place will fall apart without me. But no, Microsoft keeps on going, Frank. Maybe your department, your tiny cog in the great machine, suffers a month of disruption until they onboard your replacement, but no, they'll get along without you just fine. The reason that I think Phil Douglas, didn't tell Louise Douglas the truth is that she leaned hard into the conspiracy theory for a while. He is the victim of a frame-up. she said when reporters got to her. I know he is, and we are making an investigation. And suddenly, Phil was saying that there had been others, that someone had put the idea into his head. And not only that, he had been approached during the 1921 World Series to throw that, and he had been virtuous enough to turn them down flat. It just happened that he hadn't told anybody about it until now. This, despite Landis asking him directly if anyone else was in it, and Phil telling him no, even though he had said to the papers, I was never approached by anybody and never spoke to anybody or wrote to anybody. I have been clean all my life, and I just hoped to make the public understand my position and condition when I wrote that letter. If McGraw had only treated me a little different, I got nothing much against him personally, but I would have won the pennant for him if he hadn't ridden me so hard after they let me out of the sanitarium. That is one of the stranger sentences in baseball history. If he hadn't ridden me so hard after they let me out of the sanitarium. Louise, though, she refused to accept this. Now, was she in denial, or had he told her a different story? Phil refuses to talk. I have urged him to tell who was behind this sad mess, but he refuses. He says that he has been made the goat. I have urged him to name the guilty one or the guilty persons, if more than one there are, but he refuses on the ground that while they have taken advantage of his good nature, he will not implicate anybody. He says, if I mention names, somebody else will get into trouble, and I don't want to do that. So you see, it is a difficult situation for us. I am certain that Phil did not do this thing. I know that he is a victim of a frame-up. He is not capable of fraud. But since he declines to come out and tell everything to clear himself, I don't see what we can do but wait and hope. I really feel for this poor, deceived woman. Deep down, I think she knew. About 2 days after Douglas was banned, both he and Louise made a joint interview appearance in the New York American. Mostly the interview is Phil telling the same story I've quickly outlined here, but the writer paused for little reactions from Louise. His wife, looking on, occasionally broke into the conversation. Large, dark rings appear around her eyes. She leaned over every now and then to pet her husband, and then turned her face away to weep. She is a mild-mannered woman of motherly appearance and, like Douglas, has been prostrated by his expulsion from baseball. I don't believe they understand, she said. God knows I've tried to keep him away from liquor. Her voice broke. Shufflin Phil shuffled over in his bed. Come, sugar, he sobbed. Perk up, honey. Maybe things will come out all right yet. They didn't. The rest of his life was so hard, and so was hers, and the game was partially given away in that one statement. God knows I've tried to keep him away from liquor, and right there is why you can decide that it's okay, it's your prerogative to destroy yourself, but unless you're totally alone, you're going to take those who love you down with you. And thus it is essentially a selfish gesture. And again, I am not overlooking the kind of neurological rewiring that substance abuse addiction does to a person. It does change them, and it is a very hard thing to break. At the same time, Phil Douglas was in the majors for most of 12 years, and these kinds of conflicts came up again and again until he reached this utterly bizarre ending. He was warned repeatedly by different managers, look, we can't keep doing this. You can't keep doing this. But somehow it was kind of a game to him. But to his wife, who relied on him, making a living at baseball, to his 2 daughters, well, it wasn't a game to them. The rest of his life was very much hand to mouth. He had one skill, and he was no longer allowed to use it. On October 12th of that same disastrous year, 1922, in Birmingham, Phil was arrested, ultimately fined $10, on charges of drunk and disorderly conduct. It was Louise who had pressed the charges. Officer Harless quoted Mrs. Douglas as saying that her husband had cursed in the presence of her and her children and had acted in a wholly disorderly manner. She also said, according to Harless, that this was not the first offense of this nature during the past few months. The charges were preferred by Louise, who called officers to their home and declared Douglas had beaten her. Arresting officers said they found her with both her eyes blackened. "Come on, sugar. Perk up, honey. Maybe things will come out all right yet." In fact, she had about 5 years left to live. In September 1927, she underwent surgery for removal of some sort of cancer. It apparently didn't work. She passed around Thanksgiving of that same year. She was only 39 years old. Her children, Mary and Eunice, were 16 and 15 at the time. Both married and lived their lives. I don't know a whole lot more about it than that. According to her page at Find a Grave, Eunice, who was here on this planet with us until 1994, was the mother of 9 children. One of them, the one she named after her father, didn't survive his first year. That's so very sad to me. The original Phil, the shuffler, was still around to see that. No baby born into innocence deserves to be remembered as not a loss, but a symbol of Grandpa's failings. And I'm certainly not going to treat this second Phil Douglas that way, but I can't help but wonder if Phil, the shuffler, in his great capacity for feeling sorry for himself, saw it that way. As for John McGraw, who had always taken on troubled players, he said, "I am through with that type of player. They are more trouble than they are worth. I want young men who will take the game and themselves seriously. Douglas and men like him have given me more gray hairs than I should have. When you want them most, they are never there. With the young fellows, one at least knows that they will be there trying. Looking back on it, I was foolish to allow myself to be annoyed with Bugs Raymond and the others. I would not feel so bitter about it if Douglas had not done this final thing to me and the game of baseball. None of us is anywhere near perfect, and anybody who knows me knows that I have shown consideration for everybody's feelings. I have never been hard on any man that worked for the Giants. You can recall some of the queer characters I have had with me since I have been in baseball. They may have made funny stories, but at the same time, there was a serious side to it. I was kept awake nights wondering how I was going to win ball games with those eccentrics. I am not going to do that anymore. I am going to have discipline and will have no players who will not submit gracefully to discipline. The days of the Bugs Raymonds and the others are ended as far as I'm concerned." Even 5 years later, when McGraw was asked if he would consider acquiring Cardinals pitcher Flint Rem, who was good but also had a drinking problem, he asked back, "Why get another Bugs Raymond or Phil Douglas?" And then he traded for Shanty Hogan, the chronically overweight compulsive eater, and spent much of the rest of his career, which more or less equaled much of the rest of his life, scrutinizing Shanty's meal checks for ice cream. Some of us, we just have a type. Should you wish to hear more about Shanty Hogan and John McGraw from me, go back to episodes 91 through 94, actually. They're kind of a mini-series on both of them. I have an ongoing series of comments at stephengoldman.bsky.social, which is where you can find me should you wish to follow me on social media. You can also write us, by which I mean me, at infiniteinning@gmail.com. And there is Good Gravy, a Facebook group. Simply go to Facebook, search on Infinite Inning, and bang, you're there. I welcome your comments. I always post the episodes there first. Should you wish to support the show, and I very much hope you do, please visit patreon.com/The Infinite Inning. Gear of a rudimentary kind available at teespring.com/stores/the-infinite-inning. Original soundtrack, all of which is mine, and Dr. Rick Moring's, can be found free of charge at casualobservermusic.bandcamp.com. Finally, should you find yourself with the proverbial moment to spare, who has that? Please go to the podcatcher of your choice and rate, review, and subscribe. It helps the show gain attention. And if your podcatcher doesn't let you do those things, go make yourself a root beer float and let me know if you can actually taste all the discrete elements. Our theme song, which you're hearing now and have been listening to throughout the episode, is a co-composition of myself and Dr. Rick Moring, who says, "She said I'll be your storm crow. She promised and I shuddered. But you know, I kind of liked it. I prefer my bagels buttered." Well, I'm not sure about that bit of symbolism, but I would like a bagel myself. Maybe 2, and if I can just get hold of them, I'll be back next week with more tales from inside the infinite inning.